For nearly a quarter of a century, Desmond Kerr owned the Friday night sofa. His talk show, The Late Circle, became a national ritual. The 1 hour a week where the biggest names in film and music sat down, let their guard drop, and more often than not, made fools of themselves in the most charming way possible. Kerr's gift was simple but rare. He could turn a stumble into a punchline before the audience even had time to gasp. Awkward pauses became gold. Diva behavior became a running joke. Even the guests who arrived guarded usually left laughing at themselves. But not always. Now, at 62, having quietly stepped back from weekly hosting duties, Desmond Kerr sat down for a long-form interview and, for the first time in his career, agreed to talk plainly about the nights the red sofa nearly broke him. He didn't do it for spite, he said. He did it because after 24 years of smiling through anything, he'd earned the right to tell the truth about 6 evenings that tested every ounce of his composure. People think this job is all fun, Kerr said, and it mostly is, but there were nights I walked off that stage and just stood in the corridor for a minute, staring at the wall, wondering what had just happened to me. Here are the 6 guests he says he'll never forget, for all the wrong reasons. The first name Kerr mentioned came without hesitation: Jonah Vance, the action star known for his easy grin and tabloid-friendly bravado. Vance's appearance, back when the show was riding its highest ratings, was supposed to be a simple, high-energy hour. Instead, it became the single most chaotic broadcast in the show's history. From the moment Vance walked out, something was off. His laugh was too loud. His handshake lingered too long. He dropped into the sofa like it owed him money, and within minutes it was clear he'd had more to drink before the show than any guest ever should. At first it was funny, Kerr recalled. He was loud. He was quick. The audience was eating it up. I thought, great, this is going to be one of those episodes people talk about for years. It was just not the way he'd hoped. Vance began talking over the other 2 guests on the panel that night, a novelist and a singer, both of whom tried gamely to keep pace. He interrupted punchlines mid-delivery. He answered questions that weren't directed at him. And then, without warning, he stood up, crossed the small stage, and dropped himself directly onto Kerr's lap, throwing an arm around his shoulders like they'd known each other for decades. The whole studio went quiet for half a second, and then it just erupted. Kerr said, "I remember thinking, okay, keep smiling, keep the energy up, get him back to his seat without it looking like a rescue mission." He managed it, mostly through sheer instinct. A joke about Vance needing his own chat show, a redirect to the novelist, a raised eyebrow to the audience that got a bigger laugh than anything Vance himself had said. But when the cameras stopped, I was done, genuinely exhausted. That's the one where I went home and just sat in silence for an hour before I could even eat dinner. Vance later brushed off the appearance in interviews, saying he'd simply had a good time. Kerr, for his part, doesn't hold a grudge. He's a sweet guy, honestly. But that night, sweet wasn't really the problem. If Vance was chaos, Arthur Pell was its total opposite. The veteran actor, a man whose brooding performances had earned him 2 acting statuettes and a reputation as one of the most private figures in the business, arrived for what should have been a career retrospective interview. Instead, Kerr found himself carrying an entire 20-minute segment nearly alone. Some people just don't want to be there, and that's fair, Kerr said. But live television doesn't really allow for that. You've got a studio full of people and a camera pointed at you, and silence is the one thing you can't fill with editing later. Pell answered questions with single words. Asked about his early career, he offered, "Long time ago." Asked about a much-loved film, he simply said, "It was fine." Kerr tried humor, flattery, even mild teasing. Nothing landed. At one point, after yet another clipped answer, Kerr turned to the audience and said, half to himself, "This is hard work, Arthur," which got the biggest laugh of the segment. Pell, to his credit, cracked a small smile at that one. "It wasn't hostility," Kerr said. "He wasn't trying to embarrass me. I think he was just deeply uncomfortable in that format. The jokes, the crowd, the loose energy. Some actors live for that stage. Others feel like they're being interrogated. He was the second kind." Kerr says the Pell interview taught him something he's carried ever since. You have to be able to make silence entertaining. That's a skill nobody tells you that you'll need in this job, but you absolutely will. Long before his name became a byword for scandal, Film producer Victor Calloway appeared on Kerr's sofa to promote a project that, in hindsight, nobody much remembers. What people do remember, or at least what Kerr remembers vividly, is how the room felt while Calloway was in it. He didn't come on as a guest, Kerr said. He came on like he owned the studio. Every question I asked got twisted back into a story about his own success. Every time another guest tried to speak, he'd talk over them, louder, faster, like he was daring anyone to interrupt him instead. There was no single explosive moment, no scandal on camera. Instead, Kerr described something quieter and, in retrospect, more unsettling, a slow, suffocating dominance that drained the room of its usual warmth. The audience's laughter grew thinner as the segment went on. Kerr's own smile, normally effortless, became visibly harder to maintain. "I didn't know anything back then," Kerr said carefully. "None of us did. But looking back at that tape now, knowing everything that came out about him years later, it plays completely differently. At the time, I just thought, this man is exhausting to be around. Now I think, of course he was." Kerr says he rarely watches the old footage of that interview anymore. It's not a fun rewatch. It's a reminder that charisma and decency aren't the same thing, and sometimes you can't tell the difference until years later. Of all 6 names, Kerr says the strangest evening belonged to Lenny Marchetti, a former boxing champion turned character actor whose comeback story had made him a tabloid favorite. Audiences expected fireworks. What they got, Kerr says, was almost total silence. "He sat down and just wasn't present," Kerr said. "His eyes were somewhere else the entire time. I asked about his films, his old fights, his comeback. Nothing. He'd nod, say 2 or 3 words, and drift off again." Kerr tried every trick in his arsenal. A playful joke about Marchetti's famous comeback, a story designed to bait a reaction, even a gentle jab at himself to lower the temperature. Nothing worked. It was like talking to a wall. One crew member reportedly said afterward, according to Kerr, that one wasn't rudeness. Kerr insisted. It wasn't anger. It was just absence. And for a show that runs entirely on connection, absence is the hardest thing to work around. You can handle someone yelling at you. You can't really handle someone who just isn't there. By the end of the taping, Kerr says he was visibly drained, a fact the studio audience apparently noticed based on messages he received afterward. "You can't fake energy for 2 people," he said. "You can only survive it and hope nobody notices how hard you're working." Not every difficult night involved chaos or silence. Sometimes, Kerr says, the problem was simply tone. Case in point, veteran Western star Hope Bennett, whose visit to the show remains, in Kerr's words, one of the longest 30 minutes of my life, despite nothing going visibly wrong. Bennett arrived polished, professional, and utterly serious, answering every question with the calm, measured cadence of a man being interviewed about a policy decision rather than his latest film. The show's usual chemistry, built on overlapping jokes and unscripted tangents, never had a chance to form. He wasn't rude. He wasn't difficult in the way people usually mean that word. Kerr said, he was just completely miscalibrated for what we were doing. I'd crack a joke, and he'd pause, consider it, and then respond thoughtfully, like I'd asked a serious question. It was the most polite mismatch of energy I've ever experienced on that stage. Kerr tried nudging him toward levity with playful jabs about Bennett's tough guy screen image. Bennett smiled politely each time, but rarely engaged. Some people just don't understand what this show is for, Kerr said. It's not a hard-hitting interview. It's meant to be silly. He never quite got that memo, and I don't think anyone told him beforehand, either. By the end of the segment, Kerr admits he was simply relieved it was over. It wasn't unpleasant. It was just still, and stillness on a show built on noise is its own kind of disaster. The 6th name, Kerr says, is the one that frustrated him more than any other. Not because the guest was cruel, but because she simply refused to participate. Actress Wren Callahan, promoting a film everyone had assumed would be an easy, breezy conversation. Instead gave Kerr almost nothing to work with. She wasn't rude, Kerr clarified quickly. I want to be really clear about that. She just didn't engage. One-word answers. No laughter. No follow-up. It was like dragging a conversation uphill with a rope. Kerr tried every tool he'd built over 2 decades: humor, empathy, gentle self-deprecation. None of it broke through. The other guests on the panel grew visibly uncomfortable. The audience's energy, usually so easy to hold, began to sag. That was the one time in my whole career I actually lost patience, Kerr admitted. Not outwardly. I don't think anyone watching at home could tell, but inside, I remember thinking, I have nothing left to give this conversation, and neither does she. He says the experience taught him something humbling about his own show. The whole format only works if both people want to be there. I always assumed that was a given. That night taught me it isn't. Looking back over more than 2 decades of laughter, chaos, and the occasional catastrophe, Kerr says the 6 guests who tested him most weren't failures of the show. They were proof of how rare real chemistry actually is. People think my job is easy because I make it look easy, he said. But the truth is, 90% of what makes an interview work has nothing to do with me. It's whether the other person is willing to meet you halfway. When they are, it's magic. When they're not, you find out very quickly just how much of the job is improvisation and prayer. Kerr insists he holds no bitterness toward any of the 6. Every single one of them, in their own way, made me better at this job. You don't learn how to save a dying conversation from the easy nights. You learn it from the ones that nearly kill you on live television. So, which of these 6 would have tested your